Hey, what's up? This is Phil Shaw for PokerStrategy.com, and I'm back today to talk about Badugi in the ongoing Draw Another Game series. As you can see, I've got a slideshow for you in this part of the presentation, and then the second video in this part of the series will be live play, playing some mid stakes and trying to apply the information that we've learned here. So, as with the other games in the series, we're going to start with some basic strategy and the rules, and get on to some more advanced stuff. If you remember, we've already covered deuce to 7 single draw and deuce to 7 triple draw, and basically I'm going to try and build on some of the strategy points from those games as we go through, because they are quite similar. And if you've already watched those videos, or if you've already played those games and are quite good at them, you will certainly be able to adjust your game from those to Badugi rather than having to start it cold. So as you can see, we're going to start with the basic rules in case you have no familiarity with the game at all. As you can see, Badugi is a low ball game, and it's similar to triple draw, but there's also a lot of very different things about it, which are very important to focus on. If you're used to playing triple draw, you will need to adjust significantly, but it's still in essence a low ball game where you have to make the worst hand. So to speak. In this game, aces play low, so the best hand is ace, deuce, 3, 4 of different suits, and the aim of Badugi is to collect one card of each suit. So any complete hand is called a Badugi. So it's pretty straightforward. If you hear someone referring to a king Badugi, it means they have something like king, queen, 10, 7, one of each suit, or the nut Badugi is ace, deuce, 3, 4, which is called a wheel, as in other games. And below that, you can make try hands, which is a hand with 3 playable cards. And this means that you have something like ace deuce 3 of different suits, but then a 4 of the same suit as one of the other cards. Or you have something like ace deuce 3 with another ace deuce or 3, so then the paired card doesn't play. In this instance, you're going to be discarding the worst card. Badugi is also a triple draw game, as I haven't put in here, but there are 3 drawing rounds, as with triple draw, and the structure is the same as limit hold'em. And you need to just make sure you discard the worst card. It's pretty straightforward. If you have ace deuce 3 and you have a queen of clubs and a 3 of clubs, obviously you're going to discard the queen. And obviously, if you have a pair, it doesn't make too much difference what you discard unless you pair on a later street, in which case you want to discard the one which gives you the most live outs. And again, that's not too difficult to work out. If you have any questions about that, post in the thread, but I want to move on to some more advanced strategies, so I don't want to spend too much time in this portion of the presentation. Obviously, the best try hand is therefore ace deuce 3, which is a really strong hand, and any Badugi beats any try, so king, queen, Jack, 10 Badugi beats ace deuce 3 try, and we'll come on to the maths of the various hands and how they compare to each other in the next slide or two. The same structure applies as limit hold'em, so there's a small blind and a big blind. There are 2 small betting rounds and 2 big betting rounds, and as I was doing the triple draw, the draws are between the betting rounds. And so it's pretty straightforward. If you've played any triple draw at all, you'll be very familiar with how this works. And the only difference from triple draw is that it plays 8-handed, because each player only has 4 cards, so you're not very likely to run out of cards compared to playing a game with 5 cards. So 8-handed play is slightly unusual. It's only really applied in stud, but we'll come on to how we're going to approach that in the next slide or two. So if I move along. The next slide I've put up is, like I said, to compare Badugi and triple draw is a good thing to do. And triple draw is a much more popular game. It came online before Badugi, and has in fact been around since the early days of Ultimate Bet, so at least sort of 5 years. And the games have obviously changed somewhat in those times. And but if you played triple draw recently, you'll have some idea of strategy points of playing that game, and I think it's very useful to try and compare the two. Like I said, they're very different games in many respects, so it's important, whichever way you're going, to not get into various traps. So we'll just go through the points. I think that's the easiest thing to do. So the first one is in triple draw. When players are drawing, the last card usually decides the winner. In Badugi, it usually doesn't. So if you have, for example, if I have a Badugi and you have, if we both have draws in Badugi, and we both have draws in triple draw, what you're going to see is in triple draw, the last card will pretty much always decide what happens. If I have the deuce 3 4 7 and you have the deuce 3 5 8, those hands are pretty close to even. It's going to be 55 45 or so, because the last card will usually decide what happens, unless we get done exactly the same card, in which it will obviously go down to who had the best draw initially. So even if you have the best draw in triple draw, if I make a queen and you pair your hand, then you still lose the hand. Whereas in Badugi, if I have ace deuce 3 and you have ace deuce 4, then I'm going to win the vast majority of the time, because whatever happens with my hand, I have a very strong try, and you have to make a Badugi. So if you have the ace deuce 4, you're going to be drawing to only 10 cards or so to win, which is obviously going to mean that you only get there sort of 1 in 4 times or whatever. So obviously in triple draw, it's the game is much more fluid as opposed to Badugi, where it's really important to start with good hands. So you really must remember this in Badugi, that a made hand in Badugi is much stronger than in triple draw, and it's much harder to make a Badugi, as an obvious corollary to that. When you look at the comparisons of drawing odds, the other interesting to note is that a dealt pat versus a try is usually around 50-50. We'll come on to the odds of how this works out, but basically a dealt pat is going to be, if you have sort of king queen jack 10 versus ace deuce 3, you're going to be around 50-50 basically. So we'll come on to the various odds of dealt pats a bit later, but it's very, very close is the main thing to remember. And depending on how it's constructed, it can go slightly either way. But basically, the reason to mention this is that you're going to be keeping a lot of dealt pats in this game, as opposed to in Badugi, as opposed to in triple draw rather. And we'll come to that point now actually. Yep, so most dealt pats should be kept, whereas in triple draw you will usually break a dealt pat 9. If you watch the triple draw slides, then it's usually incorrect to keep a 9 unless it's very rough and you can't break it. So if you have something like 2, 3, 4, 7, 9, you're much better off discarding the 9 and trying to make an 8 or better, just because you're going to get much more value out of that hand, as opposed to keeping the 9, where you really need to just hope that your opponents don't outdraw you. And obviously, you're going to get a 9 or better back much more often, because you basically are, you have so many more cards to hit. Whereas in Badugi, if you break, it's very hard to get back to making another Badugi. So bear that in mind, and we'll come on to it in more detail in a bit. And an obvious continuation of all of this is that you should bet when you're in the draw if you think you have the best hand. So we've already said that it's much harder to make a Badugi than it is to make a hand in triple draw. So if you have the best one card draw, you have the ace deuce 3, and your opponents aren't pat, then you're a massive favourite. So you need to keep betting, even when you're even. And you can also bet your tries on the value for river, because people will call with slightly worse ones. So if you have the ace deuce 3 and nobody has raised or gone pat by the river, you should keep betting and hope someone calls you with ace deuce 4 or ace deuce 5 or something like that, and doesn't sort of believe you. And the final point to bring up here is that drawing is often not correct against pat hands for a big bet. As we've seen, it's very hard to make a Badugi, and we'll come on to a bit of math in a second. But just bear that in mind. And these are very, very general points, but these are the really, really key things that you need to bring across with you if you're new to Badugi, or if you've played some triple draw, but you don't want to fall into the traps of trying to play the same style. Okay, so the next slide is how to play dealt pat hands. I think it's best just to go through the different categories of hands, as opposed to looking at different rounds and sort of strategies for each round, and just basically talk about how to play pat hands, then how to play try hands, and how to play 2-card hands in various situations, whether you have them or your opponents have them. So if we go through from the top, we can get into some more detail and build on what we've already said about comparing to triple draw. So the average dealt hand in Badugi is Queen 7 5 2, which, if you're new to the game, is going to be very surprising to you, because you would think it would be much lower. So this means that if someone gets dealt a pat hand, and they go, or you get dealt a pat hand, and they go pat straight away, then the vast majority of the time they're going to have a king or a queen. It's going to be something like 60 or so percent is going to be kings and queens, and only a very tiny percent is going to be the very strong Badugis that are sort of 8 or better, because obviously there's much more combinations of hands that can make kings and queens as opposed to 5, 6s, 7s, 8s, so on. So because it's hard to make Badugis, as we've seen in the previous slide, you should keep most pats initially, unless they're very bad in early position and you're likely to end up in a multi-way pot, or they're weak, unbreakable, and facing action. So if you get dealt something like King, Queen, Jack 10, and you're under the gun and you're playing 8-handed, then it's unlikely you're going to get that heads up, and there's not very much you can do with your hand apart from try and get it to showdown and hope that everyone misses. So you may be 50-50 with that hand against a single player drawing one card with a try hand. But if you get multiple players in the pot, then obviously those odds are going to go down. So, for example, in very, very rough terms, if 2 players are drawing against you and they both have a 50% chance of beating you, then suddenly you only have a 25% chance of winning the hand. And obviously, if you're putting in a third of the money, then you're going to lose on that proposition. So you need a better jack, I would say, to sort of be playing from early position, and you can certainly play your kings and so on once you get into middle and late position, and if you can get them heads up against other players, it's still fine to do that. Obviously, knowing who you're up against, how aggressive they're going to be, and how much trouble they're going to give you is also useful. So, having said what we've just said there, it's important to note next that hands like Ace Deuce 3 King are not hands that you want to pat. For the obvious reason that Ace Deuce 3 and Ace Deuce 3 King are not that different in strength. If you have Ace Deuce 3 King, the only hands that you're beating that Ace Deuce 3 are not beating is worst kings that your opponent might make. So, and even if your opponent is pat, he'll quite often have a hand better than a king, and you will quite often make a hand that beats him anyway. And obviously, you have to risk all the implied and reverse implied odds of not making your hand, of keeping your hand and having somebody else make a better hand, and having to break later or having to consider, what to do, because you've made an error in the early stages. So basically, if you have the Ace Deuce 3 King, obviously break it. Where to draw the line is again an interesting question, because if you have a queen or a jack, then obviously you're beating a few more hands. A jack is probably again a good place to draw the line. But if you have something like the Deuce 3-8 King, then obviously you want to keep the 8, you want to keep the King, because you're not beating very many try hands with your 2-3-8 pat, with your 2-3-8 try rather. But again, that's a hand that can be broken. Therefore, if you face action, so if you do find yourself with some hands that are smooth but quite bad in terms of their overall Badugi, then you can play those pat to start with and then break them later. So if you have like the Ace Deuce 7 Queen Badugi, then you can certainly pat that to start with, and if you get loads of action and people go pat, you can certainly then break it off. So that's pretty straightforward, I think, and we'll see more of how this works in action when we get to the videos. But I do think it's better to do some theory first, and you can always return and watch this later, or watch the video first of live play and come back here if you prefer. So the basic betting strategy is always to raise and re-raise with pat hands. Some people do try to keep the pot small to bet people out later, but generally you want to try and get the pot heads up. So you want to be raising initially, and if someone raises in front of you, you want to be re-raising then, trying to knock out players behind. Because having a pat Badugi is always quite a vulnerable situation to be in, unless it's super strong, and you don't really want to be slow playing very much at all, just because people will get suspicious, and it's very hard to balance, and it doesn't really work with balancing it with playing weak Badugi slowly, just because, like I've said, you let too many people in behind. So I just play the hands aggressively and raise and re-raise, try to get the pot heads up, or at least knock players out behind you, and get value if you have a strong hand like a jack or better from the other players, and then keep betting until you're raised or another player pats. And that's pretty obvious. If you've got a pat hand and everyone else is drawing, you want to charge them, and nobody's going to raise you unless they pat themselves or they're trying to bluff you, which we'll come into a minute. And then basically what will happen is everyone will keep drawing. you'll hope, and then you'll get to the river, and you want to check and call with your sort of medium strength hands, and only fold really the absolute worst hands, and then only value bet the absolute best hands. So in terms of that, you can probably fold your worst kings, as we've seen in the triple draw videos. For the purposes of game theory, you can fold the bottom part of your range and not be exploited, because people won't get you to fold often enough to have the correct odds to try and bluff. So it's certainly fine to sort of fold, check fold some bad kings. And obviously, if you've gone pat from the start and the average is a queen, you certainly want to bet all eights or better for value on the river. People will call you thinking you might be snowing with a trap, with a try hand, and you could even bet like nines and stuff. But once you get to tens, and certainly some rough nines, it might just be better to check and call, because people will try and bet worse Badugis against you for value. So you'll still get a bet if someone makes a 10 or a jack, whereas you don't really want to sort of bet your 10 and get raised and not know what to do. So if you have a Badugi and somebody raises, you then have to evaluate the situation. Most of the time you're going to have a bad Badugi, so this is not a good situation to be in, obviously, because it's not very likely when you're raised that you're winning, but also you don't necessarily want to just let people bluff you out. So what you want to do is decide how good your hand is compared to the average, and fold the worst unbreakable hands against tight players. So if you have a queen or a king and you think your opponent is just never bluffing you or trying to semi-bluff you, you can just give those hands up straight away. If they're unbreakable, if it's like the queen, jack, 10, 9, or whatever, you can't do anything with that hand. As I said before, though, if you have something like the 2, 3, 6 queen and a tight player raises you, you can then just call and break and draw, because the pot's already going to be pretty big from the previous street's action, and you can try and outdraw them. And if you make an 8 or better, you're pretty happy with your hand. So that's a basic strategy against tight players. However, against an aggressive player, you have a slightly tougher situation, because aggressive players will try and raise with strong try hands to make you break or fold your weak pat hands. So what you don't want to do is give up too easily. So if you have something like the king, queen, jack, 10, and your heads up with an aggressive player and they raise, you want to make them go pats before you give up on the next street. So you want to call and pats to their raise, and if they draw, then obviously you can keep betting. But if they go pat, you can give up. Or similarly, if your hand is breakable, you can then break if you think the equity is greater and you have something like the 2, 3, 6 queen. That's pretty basic to do against aggressive players. Most people aren't going to sort of like make suicide bluffs against you by padding and trying to get you to fold on a later street. Obviously, some people will, so watch out for that. But for the most part, if people pad against you, you can give them some credit, and you obviously can then fold the bottom of your range, which is kings and some queens. And if you have sort of like the 9, 10, jack and good queens, you may call down anyway, just in case they're trying to blow you out with a worse pat hand, or just making an outright bluff. And a lot of this is sort of really dependent on players, so we'll see more of it in the videos, hopefully. And if you get a pat 8 Badugi dealt to you from the start, then that's really a massive hand, sort of going to be in the top sort of I don't know, sort of 10-15% of overall hands, and it's a super strong hand. You really want to just put a lot of action in with that as much as possible, and unless your opponents really start to put in tons of bets, then those hands are really strong. And you don't really slow down with something like an 8 if people are betting and raising and padding. Whereas obviously you'll get extra value if people are trying to raise you off their hand with a worse Badugi, or just trying to get value from worse Badugi, or trying to raise you with a sort of semi-bluff hand. And if you get something dealt pat as strong as a 5 or a 6, then you're going to put a lot of bets in on most streets before you're happy to give up, because that's just in sort of like the top few percent of hands, and your opponents will really sort of not expect you to have it very often. Okay, so that covers sort of the basics of how to play the pat hands. Now, how do you play against pat hands is the next question. We've already seen that. If you're drawing against a pat hand, then your odds are not great of getting there, and it's like 50-50 from the start. But that's over 3 draws, not over 1 draw. So you need to consider the strength of your opponent's hand and the strength of your hand. And as we've seen, the average dealt Badugi is a queen 7-5-2, so it's not a very strong average. So for the most part, if the pot's of a reasonable size, you can keep drawing with a reasonable try hand. So if there's if there's been a raise and a re-raise pre-draw, then the pot's usually going to be big enough that you have the correct odds to call to the river. And obviously, if you make your hand, you can put a bet in on the river, and your opponent will usually call, or you can check raise or raise, so you'll get some additional value on top of the basic odds that you need there. Typically, people talk about playing try-eights as sort of being a cut-off for the tries that you want to play. However, because people usually have Queen Badugis or King Badugis when they're pats, you can certainly draw to a 9 and perhaps even a 10 in some situations for the small bet round. But I would usually fall for the big bet just to balance things out, because you're not always going to be good when you make those hands. But you can certainly draw to something like a 9 against a pat, just because you know that when you make your hand, you're going to be good for the vast majority of the time. So there's not that much difference to having 3, 2, and 8. And we've already talked about playing aggressive players when you have the pat hand. However, if you have the try hand and you're against an opponent with a pat hand, if you can get them to break or fold, then obviously that's a massive victory for you. We've seen in triple draw, trying to get your opponents to break is not that profitable nowadays, and doesn't happen that often. But in Badugi, people tend to obviously play much more rough Badugis, and weaker players will often give up just to a raise. They won't even check that you're going to be padding by calling and waiting to see, or they'll break too easily. And for this reason, when you have strong tries, you really want to try and get them to break quite often. And for balancing purposes, you want to try and you want to raise strong players with strong tries as well, just because you want to balance out at the times that you're pad anyway. So basically, if you have sort of like the ace, anything from ace deuce 3 to maybe ace deuce 5, you want to be occasionally making raises, depending on how weak and likely to break your opponent is. You're obviously not going to raise a lot of hands against stronger opponents, but against the weaker opponents, you might raise quite wide to try and get them to break. And the obvious benefit of this is that somebody has like the 2-3-6 queen, and you have the ace deuce 4 try, and you get them to break, then suddenly you're a massive favourite as opposed to a massive underdog. So making that raise on any streets is a good idea. Often people will sort of call and draw one on the small bet street, then raise the big bet street because it looks more believable. But doing it at any point is a good idea, and can often get your opponents to fold or to break, which is obviously what you want. And the final thing to consider is what to do when you have pat versus pat. Obviously, both you and your opponent have very weak ranges. Obviously, if you have a very strong Badugi, you're just going to put lots of bets in and try to get your opponent to call you down. However, one thing you can do is when you have the absolute bottom of your range, say you have the King, Queen, Jack 10, and you run into another player with a Badugi dealt pat to them, you can then try and get them to break or fold the best hands by playing it aggressively and putting lots of bets and raises in, and just really sort of playing chicken with them, basically. So obviously if you have King, Queen, Jack 10, there's nothing you can do with a hand you can't draw, and folding is obviously an option, but it's not going to win you any money. But if you put lots of bets in, your opponent might fold or break a bad king or a queen that can be broken or something, and then you're in a nice lead at that point, and you can take the hand to showdown and hopefully win against a try hand or get your opponent to fold. So that should cover most of how to play a dealt pat hand. It's reasonably straightforward if you have some experience. So the next category is the made pat hands. So this is when you're drawing and you make a hand, or your opponent's drawing and they make a hand. We're going to start out by looking at some quick odds. Here things are quite different in terms of your opponent's averages, and needs to be considered when you're drawing or people are drawing against you. So just to get it down pretty quickly, a player who goes one pat who draws one and goes pat. That's what I mean by that. Has an average hand of an 8 or 9 Badugi. It's pretty straightforward. If I have ace deuce 3, there's 10 cards left, and the average card I'm going to hit is an 8 or a 9. So that's straightforward enough. If I'm drawing 2 and I make Badugi, then my average hand is a rough 10. If you do the combinations, then basically there's, I'm really just ignoring, all sort of other considerations and doing this very straightforwardly. So if you have 2 cards, there's 11 cards left in the deck, and or 11 individual values left in the deck. I'm making it really simple by ignoring, the possibilities of, various things. But your average is going to be, I think 11 C2 is 55, so the 28th hand in the sequence is going to be, I think, 7, 8, 9, 10. So the roughest 10 Badugi is pretty much the average in this situation, just as a rule of thumb. And when you consider this compared to drawing against a queen, what you should notice is that the number of outs you have is much lower. So if your opponent has an 8 or a 9, you have only 5 or 6 outs. If your opponent has a rough 10, you have 7 outs. So whereas in the situation where you're drawing against a queen and you suddenly have 9, 10 outs, or whatever it is on average, here you've really been cut down. So now you need to think about the odds that you're getting. And whereas we've seen once the pot gets reasonably big, you can draw against a pat Badugi with a try hand. When the player has drawn and gone pat, then suddenly the odds get much less favourable for you. So it's very rough. But 6 to 1 to 8 to 1 is going to be sort of the odds that you need, depending on whether they went 2 to pat or 1 to pat. And if you think about the sort of sequences of betting that go on to get to the big bet round, which is where you usually face the moment of choice, then it's not really that favourable. So if you're playing 10-20 and the cutoff raises and I re-raise on the button, then there's going to be 65 in the pot at that point, and there's going to be 85 in the pot by the time the next 2 small bets go in. And so if my opponent bets 20 into the 85 pot on the next round, then I'm only getting slightly over 5 to 1. So in that situation, if I think my opponent is not ever snowing me or what have you, and I'm not going to get much additional value out of him on later streets, then my decision is probably to fold. If he's gone 1 to pat, and it's going to be a mistake to draw if the pots of that size are smaller. So as opposed to triple draw, where you usually keep drawing, in Badugi, it's often a big mistake to just keep drawing on the big bet round, regardless. Of course, if the pot is heads up and very big because multiple bets have gone in. So, for example, if another couple of bets had got in on the initial round, so for example, if my opponent had raised, I had 3 bets with a try hand and he had 4 bets with his pat hand, that would make the pot about the right size. Or if the pot was somehow multi-way, again, it would make it the right size to continue drawing to a good try hand, and then I would be fine to do that. And similarly, if the pot was of a reasonable size and I saw my opponent go 2 to pat, that would be fine. So obviously, just to comparing the odds here, obviously, if your opponent is drawing has gone 2 to pat, you're going to need about 6 to 1, and if your opponent's got 1 to pat, it's going to need about 8 to 1. So just doing the numbers in your head very quickly when you get to that point in the hand is very important, and giving up in small pots, heads up pots, is never a big mistake, basically. So we've talked about what to do when your opponent has the drawing hand and goes pat. When you have the pat hand, you should basically consider the strength of it when you get to the river. Obviously, be betting the whole way, unless you get raised, in which case you're going to put more action in with the strongest hands, which are basically 4s, 5s, 6s, 7s. and call down with medium strength hands like 8s, 9s, 10s. And basically, you want to consider when you get to the river what's your hand looks like. If you could have been in a snowing position, if you'd raised in late position and gone 1 to pat or something, you definitely want to bet all your Badugas on the river because people can call you with try hands thinking you might be snowing, and you want to you want to be raising when you make a Badugi and other players have not gone pat before you, regardless of its strength, because you can knock people out, and people will bet the strongest try hands anyway. And the last point here is just that basically, if you make a 5 or a 6 in this game, that's a really strong hand, and it's very rarely going to be beaten. So I'm going to put a lot of action in with those hands if I make them, and something like a 5, you're just probably going to put the max in on most streets, apart from the river. And similarly with 6s, you're only really going to slow down with these hands once you get to the river. 7s are a bit weaker, but obviously you can play them aggressively against some hands, and this will depend on the players you're up against. In the lower limit game, some people are very passive, so you need to bear this in mind and adjust accordingly depending on what you're seeing in the games. So the next category is try hands, obviously the 1-card draws, as you might call them. So as we've seen already, the best try hand will often win. So draw smooth is the absolute key points. So ace deuce 3, ace deuce 4, ace 3 4 are the sort of hands that you want ideally. These are all hands that can win at showdown, that people are unlikely to beat. So you're going to play them aggressively and from all positions, and bet them the whole way until somebody goes pat or raises you, and indicates that they have a stronger try hand. If you have the ace 3 4 or whatever, and they seem pretty clear to have the ace deuce 3. You're going to play them for all positions, and the opposite thing to remember is to not play rough try hands. So in the early positions, avoid rough tries. 5, 6, 7, 6, 7, 8, really not great hands, because you're just going to run into people with stronger tries, and you're going to have to make a Badugi to win. However, do note that smooth tries, even if they're not that great to start with, can improve to better tries. So ace deuce 8, ace 3 7, hands that can make Badugis, obviously by catching the card of the suit that's required that doesn't pair, but they can also improve. So like if you have the ace of hearts, 2 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, you can catch a better card that's a 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7, and your try hand will improve. And similarly, ace 3 7, the 7 can become a deuce if you catch a better deuce of the same suit as the 7. So those hands are fine because they will become smooth tries as well as Badugis. So they have 2 ways to improve. So we're just going by, because there's 8 seats at the table, we're just going by 2 seats at a time. So obviously 2 seats in the blinds. The first 2 seats are in early position. The second 2 seats are middle position, as far as I'm concerned, and button and cut off are late position. So when you get to middle position, obviously you're in a much better shape to play some rougher Badugis. So something like 4, 5, 6 isn't that bad. 3, 5, 7 isn't that bad. And in late position, on the button and cut off, you can open much wider. Obviously there's a big difference between button and cut off, and obviously it depends if you're in the cut off who the button is, and if they're very aggressive or very passive. But generally opening sort of up to sort of 8 tries, all 8s on the button, is not going to be a bad strategy. And basically in the cut off, maybe the worst 8s should be folded if you're against an aggressive player. But a lot of this really depends on who the blinds are and who the button is. So you can mix it up a bit and raise wider if people are bad, or they're very easy to sort of to snow against, or they just fold too much, which is obviously the best scenario. So we've talked about up to 8 tries a number of times in this slide. Generally, you're not playing 9s or 10s. And we've already mentioned this. You don't really want to play 9s or 10s unless you find yourself against a double Badugi, in which case it's fine, or in case you make it on a later street when you were drawing 2. So if you had ace deuce and you were drawing to 2 cards because you had pairs and suits, making a 9 isn't that bad, because then you can just represent you have a strong try and balance your ranges in that way. Or if you had something like, if you had a bad two card hand to start with, like you'd raise with ace 5 on the button, and you catch ace 5 9, there's not, you might not, or even, ace 6 9 or something, because you raise with ace 6. It's not a huge amount of reason to discard the 9 as opposed to keeping it and just sort of representing a stronger hand than you have. So we'll come on to that point in a second. So my next point is just about snowing. We've seen how snowing works in triple draw. Basically, you are patting to represent a strong hand and freezing your, sort of basically hoping your opponent folds, thinking that they can't win with whatever they have, and you're doing it with the bottom of your ranges. Obviously, in triple draw, it's easy to make hands, so snowing is slightly more popular in that game. In Badugi, if you can get away with it, you should obviously snow a lot, but the typical equilibrium strategy is to not snow a huge amount, just because it's so hard to make Badugis that if you're snowing all the time, people are going to call you down with try hands and beat you. And one unfamiliar quirk of Badugi, if you play triple draw, is that when you snow in Badugi, you're quite often freezing your equity at 0, because people will call with try hands and call down with try hands. In fact, a player who is sort of calling with try hands for the big bet and folding too often on the river is very exploitable. So what tends to happen in Badugi is that you need to be slightly careful about basically snowing in situations and against players who are just going to go to showdown with a lot of try hands. Whereas in triple draw, basically, you always have snow equity because your opponent might just pair their top card and you have no choice but to fold. So say I raise with 3, 4, 5, 7 in triple draw and pair up or make a straight or whatever and decide to snow. That's a fine decision because my opponent still has to make a hand to call. He has to make basically a 9 or 10, or basically a 9 on one of the early streets, maybe, or a jack on the river to call me down. And if he makes a worse hand, or he pairs, or makes a straight, he really has very little option but to fold. Whereas in Badugi, if I raise, my sort of, my, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, and pat on the button, then, and my opponent's drawing 1, he can still call down all the way because all he has to do is have a better try hand than the hand that I'm staying with, which is not that hard. So do bear in mind that you need to consider sometimes not snowing in the conventional fashion, and in fact sort of semi-snowing by betting a try for a bluff, which we'll come on to in a second. So basically, that covers most of my points. When you have try versus try, which is my next point, you need to call down just because you have a lot of outs. Even if I have ace deuce 3 and you have ace deuce 4, I still have obviously 10 outs or so to make my hands. And if I make my hand, I'm only going to lose if you make your hand too, which is not going to happen that big a percentage at the time. So if it's draw versus draw, you're typically going to be trying to make your hand, unless the pot's very tiny. But you do have to consider that your opponent might make that hand too and factor those odds in. But again, the pot's usually big enough that doesn't really need to be a big consideration. So call down and draw against other tries if you're unlikely to have the best hand. But fold to the big bet if a player was drawing goes pats and the pot was heads up and multi-way and small. So as we've already seen, following on from the previous slide, once your opponent goes pat, your odds really cut down from 10 outs to 5 or 6 or 7 basically. So you really need to adjust based on that. When you get to the river, you can make a number of plays in triple draw, in Badugi that you can't make in triple draw. As we've seen, you have to make a hand in triple draw, whereas in Badugi, you can bet in completes for value. So if you have the ace deuce 3 and you're against another player drawing, it's a no-brainer for you to bet there and hope that they call with a slightly worse hand. And against aggressive players in aggressive games, a hand as weak as ace deuce 5 might be bet on the river, because your opponents might call with a slightly worse 5 or even a 6, believing you can have a lot of hands in your range, a lot of try hands in your range that were worse, and As I've already said, you want to bluff sometimes with tries, as opposed to on the river, and keep drawing the whole way, as opposed to padding and freezing your equity. And this is a good balance to betting ace deuce 3 for value. So as I've already said, you might pick up the ace deuce 9 at some point, and bet that the whole way. And if you have that hand, there's no reason to really pat with it, and freeze your equity. You may as well just draw the whole way, and because you can make some pretty strong Badugis with it still, and get additional value from them. And you can still try to bet on the river because your opponents will think you're representing a hand like ace deuce 3, and fold some sort of mediocre try hands like sevens and eights. And it's much less polarized than going pat. So your opponents will just think you're going thin value, and sophisticated players will give you credit and fold. So just remember to be balanced with the try hands is the final point. And coming on to the final slide now, two card hands. Now, obviously there are not many of these in triple draw, and because it's hard to improve in Badugi, there are not many in Badugi either. Generally, you don't play them in the early positions, although ace deuce and ace 3, can be open in middle position. If you're in some game where people are just horrible and play very passively and limp and stuff, then I'd probably just play my ace deuce in early position if I can get in cheaply with it, and maybe even my ace 3 if everyone's really bad. But generally, when you have a two card hand, you're really going uphill. So I would consider, them not strong hands to play, just because you really have to improve, significantly by making some sort of Yahtzee Badugi, or catching 3, 4, or 5. And this is surprisingly difficult to do. If you've played any sort of amount of Badugi, you'll be surprised at the amount of times you have ace deuce and you just don't improve for 2 or 3 streets, and it's very frustrating. So, but once you get to the middle positions, certainly ace deuce and ace 3 are openable, and you should always raise when you're first in. If someone's limped in front of you, it's debatable as to whether you should raise and isolate or limp, and it depends on a number of factors that we won't go into here, so I don't really have time. Then once you get to the late position, you want to open up a bit more, and suddenly ace 4, 2, 3, 2, 4, 3, 4, and maybe even ace 5 are playable. Again, this depends on the players in the blinds and the player on the button. So, if you're in the cutoff, then obviously, depending on how aggressive the button is, you might raise relatively wide, or you might raise relatively tight. And if you're on the button and the blinds are particularly weak, you might raise hands like a7 or d7 even, and any 6, any 2 to a 6, because you have position, and you can just play, sort of your hand in a variety of ways. And as we've seen in triple draw, which obviously goes for all poker games, but draw is most important for it. Position is absolutely key. So you want to play a very wide selection of hands in a position if you think you can get away with it. Obviously, if you're raising super wide on the button, the blinds, if they're not stupid, we'll pick up on this eventually and play back at you. So you do need to be a bit careful about not raising absolute trash like 8-7 or whatever in those situations, but you can get away with a lot of hands, and you have the options to control the size of the pot and the bets and so on, and snow and value bet and so on when you need to. So, yep, definitely play wide in late position, and just bear your opponents in mind. As for multi-way situations with these hands, they're not great hands to play unless there's a lot of implied odds. So, like if a good player raises an early position, like overcalling with ace deuce and ace 3 is not probably a fantastic play, because their range is already pretty strong and will be pretty solid. You may get raised behind, or may not end up in position even in the hand. So play them typically when the pot's multi-way, because there's a raise and call already, or there's several limps, or you think everyone is terrible and is playing hands that you have a lot of equity against. Obviously, if you have the ace deuce and somebody's likely to raise with hands like 6, 7, 8, then you're in great shape, because they're not going to improve a huge amount, but you're obviously going to catch 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8 a huge amount of the time. So if people are raising with quite wide ranges in early position, then do overcall. And if you're in the blinds, obviously call with these hands, and if it's multi-way, obviously call with these hands. Then when you get to being in the blinds, you can defend much lighter, obviously, because you have money in already. So I'd certainly call ace deuce and ace three in the blind positions. Um, if you have a sort of ace deuce against a very tight early position player, and you're in the small blind, it's going to be pretty narrow, I would think. But again, you can decide based on the exact situation, and if the pot's going to be multi-way, or the big blind's a very bad player who might come in too. Those are the sort of factors that might swing it. So certainly just try to consider all the little things when making a decision. And if your opponent is raising a late position, then in the big blind you can defend pretty light. Like 2 to a 6 is going to be okay in most situations. Although kind of like very rough hands like 5 6 and 6 7 are not great hands to play against anybody who's competent, just because you're not going to improve often enough to hands that you can show down. If you have 5 6 and your best case scenario is often catching an ace or something, apart from obviously banking a Badugi somehow, which is very very hard to do with a 2 card hand. You're not really going to be very happy calling that ace 5 6 down the whole way. So avoid sort of the rough hands unless your opponents are pretty weak. Obviously, if you have like ace 6, again, that's a hand that can improve to a better try or even a better 2 card hand and go from there. So bear that in mind. But out of position, play tight is the basic mantra you should use. And on the later streets, basically, if your opponent goes pat and you haven't caught a card to go to a try hand, you're in just horrible shape, and you should just probably give up straight away, unless the pot somehow got massive or multi-way. However, if your opponent's still drawing and their range is reasonably wide for their try hands, you certainly want to draw at least once again, because with ace deuce, you have obviously a lot of equity against sort of rougher try hands, and this even goes as far as drawing again on the big bet rounds. So any 2 card hand is going to draw again against a try hands for the small bets. But ace deuce and ace three can probably draw again if your opponent has a wide range for the big bet too, just because you have a relatively large number of cards to improve, and it's unlikely they're going to make a Badugi. So basically you want to take the odds and roll with it. So that pretty much concludes this section of the presentation. I think we've covered everything by going through it in this particular way. If you do have any questions, please post them in the thread. Otherwise, I'll see you next time for the live play section. And that's Phil for PokerStrategy.com, and thanks for watching.